I'll try to be very quick and hopefully provocative. So, as Masha pointed out, the name of my title today is How Public Discourse Changes Private Conversation Between Strangers. And this is a very formal and complicated title that says, how do things that happen at the top levels of society, government, media, change the way that strangers deal with each other? And this was actually the third title that Masha and I sort of agreed upon. The second title was, in fact, 4 questions that every expat is asked. And in fact, the first title, what I really wanted to do, which is nearest and dearest to my heart, is Мои приключения в барах Москвы. And I'll tell you exactly why this happens. So what it'll do is it'll essentially tell you sort of these very modal sort of interactions that I've had, in sort of bars and restaurants. And what you'll see is that the 4 questions that I get asked every single time, what they do is they change in the tone of the question, and they change in essentially what is the 4th question. So I first came to Russia in order to do research for my dissertation in late 2012. And this was the time, if you can remember back, перезагрузка, the reset. And let me tell you, people, I don't know how excited they were to see me personally, but every time they met an American, people seemed to genuinely be interested in me and really want to talk to me. And so what I found out is over the last couple years, I get asked the exact same 4 questions every single time. I can, in fact, it's like the flooding of the Nile. I can set my watch to it. And the first question is, what happens if, let's say, I'm with my friend Timur. Timur is a dear friend of mine, and every so often we go to a bar, drink beer, talk about the news, regular stuff. And people hear us speaking in Russian, and as you can hear, I have an accent. But sometimes, I'll call over, Timur, ты хочешь еще одно? And мы сидим в библиотеке, конечно. So we have this sort of interaction, and people hear either me speaking to other expats in English, or they hear this sort of like heavily accented Russian. And invariably someone will ask me, Откуда ты? Я из Техаса. And in 2012, the questions that I would then receive would be, Техас, где шляпка, где лошадь, где оружие, где ботинки? The usual questions whenever Texans leave Texas, we get asked the same questions everywhere across the world. And I'd always say, no, забыли дома, usual. And so then what I realized is, after откуда ты, then the questions would be, чем ты занимаешься здесь в Москве? Я доцент в Высшей школы экономики. Или я аспирант из Техасского университета. Then people would ask, sort of generic follow-on questions. The third question, and this was always sort of the interesting one to me, is, зачем ты приехал сюда? And this was, of course, who knows exactly what the right answer is, but I tell people I enjoy Moscow very much. My colleagues at the university are great, especially like the classes that I teach. And in fact, Dasha right here is one of my former students, an excellent one. And teaching at HSC has been wonderful. I have so many things that I can talk about as to why I enjoy being in Moscow, why I enjoy being at HSC. And I'd go on, and people would be relatively satisfied with that. And then it would get to the 4th question. And this is the 4th question. The first 3, I mean, you can put them in stone. They never change. But the 4th question is, что ты думаешь о? And the o, this, what follows next, is really what follows as to essentially the person who's talking to me, what he or she is sort of most concerned about, or what is most controversial in the news, or essentially the one thing, that they've been waiting to ask a foreigner in the days, weeks, months, years of their life when they've been thinking about this issue. And so what I started to notice is that every time there was a new controversy, I would get asked my opinion on that controversy. And I could go without opening the internet, without watching TV, without listening to the radio, and know exactly what's going on. So just to put you back in the mindset of where things are. So when I come to Russia, the first controversy was the castling, rokirovka. This was the big issue of that day, 2012, so forth. And people would ask, what is it about public opinion? What is it about, like, protests, etc.? I get these questions all the time. but it was still fairly pleasant. Then the next, and really the first big sort of negative controversy. The Jackson-Vanik Act was repealed in the United States, where I'm from, and was replaced by the Magnitsky Act. So suddenly I had to become an expert on everything about Dela Magnitskova. Against my will, but I started to learn everything I could because I got asked this all the time. And that was replaced by the Dima Yakovlev Act, which banned the adoption of Russian citizens by American citizens, the Guantanamo list, and the Victor Bout list. So I get asked about this all the time. And people would essentially still be friendly, but not as friendly as before. Then came Edward Snowden, in which people could not wait to really enjoy how much they asked me about Edward Snowden. Tseru, tseru, tseru. And okay, we'll talk, have a discussion about civil liberties, have a discussion about the role of intelligence in foreign policy formulation. Happy to do so. Then came Conchita Wurst, which had nothing to do with America, but just the mania about gay people just started. And this was also at the time that gay marriage was really taking off legally in the United States. So I was asked, how can you live in a country that has gay marriage? And I said, I actually live in Russia, so I don't know. But then sort of all these things are usually at a basic level of controversy. But then we really get to the point where I really started to know the difference in terms of how public discourse really affected these private exchanges much more negatively. And this, of course, has to do everything to do, starting from the Maidan in Kiev and all the way through Crimea, Donbass, MH17, and the sanctions. These are now the 5 things, essentially one of those 5 things I get asked about all the time. And it's actually quite negative. And so this is where essentially we begin to start to think, and Dasha might remember this from our class, where we start to think, how does public opinion, and I'll get back to these 4 questions in a second, but we really have to start to think about how does public opinion change foreign policy formulation. And in the general sort of, for the people who study public opinion and foreign policy formulation, it basically comes down to essentially one of 2 ideas in terms of the debate on how people think of the controversy of public opinion. And essentially the basic debate is, can a society, essentially public, общество itself, improve the quality of foreign policy and diplomacy? That's the big question. Yes, no. In one tradition, it's called the liberal tradition, and it goes back to Immanuel Kant, who was, of course, in those days it was Königsberg, but today Kaliningrad, which I don't know if anyone's actually gone to Kaliningrad. 1, it's a lovely place. 2, there's Immanuel Kant everywhere. The whole place is like a museum to Immanuel Kant. The Federal University, the cathedral, lovely place, you should definitely go. But Immanuel Kant, and later through people such as Jeremy Bentham and Woodrow Wilson, they roughly argue that the public itself can constrain policymakers, so therefore democracies are the best type of government. And they had this idea that if the public is the one who has to pay extra taxes for war, if the public is the one who has to send, their children to go to war, well, unless the public is really convinced on something, the public is going to constrain those policymakers. So the policymakers, president, prime minister, king, whomever, they're not going to go to war unless it's serious. So that's sort of the liberal tradition, which really looks towards a beneficial view of society itself. The sort of second tradition and the opposing tradition is sort of called the realist tradition, and this goes back to names such as Alexis de Tocqueville, Hans Morgenthau, George Kennan, E.H. Carr, so on and so forth. And in essence, if you sort of boil down their view, whereas, let's say, Immanuel Kant was saying, yes, society is good, democracy is good, these other guys were saying, I'm not so sure about that. And in essence, their beliefs were, or they're skeptical about the public because diplomacy requires long-term strategic vision, speed, secrecy, and flexibility. The public, in their view, and sort of this realist view, is emotional and short-term. And they might, in fact, stop policymakers when the policymakers know best. And so this is where you have the difference in opinion. Is the public good in constraining, or is the public bad in constraining? That's essentially the controversy. But interestingly, both of these positions, public good, public bad, it has this assumption which which many theorists don't really consider to be an assumption. They just sort of think it's, axiomatic. And the assumption is that the public and the policymakers have this adversarial relationship. Policymakers want this, the public wants that, and how do they fight it out? But what if, contrary to this assumption, or sort of, if you make a lemon to this assumption, you have policymakers that are exceedingly popular, like really, really popular. And so this is essentially the situation that we're now in the Russian Federation. So I'm sure most of you have heard of or have looked up the Levada Center, which does public policy polling within Russia. If you don't, it was, anyway, levada.ru, you can go take a look. And what they did in their last series of public opinion polling is ask a series of questions about the president and about the handling of whatever's happening in Ukraine. And they found, for the fourth time since President Putin became elected, that his approval ratings have gone above 80%. And in fact, as of July 2015, i.e. a few months ago, he set a personal record in popularity at 89%. That means of the people that Levada Center polled, 89% approved of the job performance versus 11% that disapproved. And the other three times are late 1999, around the Second Chechen War, late 2003 at the end of an anti-oligarch campaign and over disagreements with the United States and Iraq, and 2008 following the peaceful transition of power between President Putin to President Medvedev, as well as the war in Georgia. And so President Putin's approval ratings are 89%, never been higher. Trust has gone from January 2014 to the present from 34% to 59%, 35% higher than the next politician, Sergei Shoigu. The readiness to vote for President Putin has gone from 30% to 55%, and likely voters, 80% will vote for President Putin. So essentially we have a situation right now in which, following sort of all the events from Maidan to the present, we have what in political science is called the rally around the flag effect. We have, this is also, as I mentioned once before, this was in fact a test question on Dasha's first test. So hopefully she was familiar with this. But what we have in terms of the rally around the flag effect is whenever essentially the body politic, society itself, feels that there is a threat to the country or to the nation, i.e. the people, they will then support their leadership. And this is essentially a powerful effect that we observe in democracies fairly rarely, but when they happen, they really happen strongly. Now, usually, people approve or disapprove of a government, not just in Russia, but sort of everywhere across the world, depending on how the economy is doing. It's what they call pocketbook voting. If the economy is good, I'm feeling great, the future's bright, let's keep the same guy. If the economy is not doing very well, maybe it's time for a change. But in terms of having a sort of series of foreign policy crises, whatever's happening in Maidan, whatever's happening in Ukraine, whatever's happening with Crimea, with Donbass, with sanctions, there has been an extremely powerful demonstration of this rally around the flag effect, which in a general sense means that the quote-unquote oversight that any public is able to do is in fact not very strong. So what's been and we can sort of guess, like, where does this rally around the flag effect come from? One, you turn on the TV, there's always bad news coming from Ukraine. But you can also imagine that the mistrust of the West that dates back from the late 1990s, that obviously your parents are very well familiar, that you guys remember as kids, massive consumption of TV news, which is pretty much one direction, as well as nostalgia for lost superpower status. These are essentially the open doors which help explain why the support for the president is not only high, but has been sustained over the past year and a half. So in effect, what has happened in a macro sense? From June 2014 to June 2015, 500,000 expats left Russia. That may not be a bad thing, depending on your opinion, but you can see the direction is going one way. And now, when I get the same four questions, I can tell you exactly what happens. Вы откуда? Я из Техаса. Понял. Джордж Буш, понял. Чем вы занимаетесь? Я доцент в Высшей школе экономики. Работаете в университете? Понял. А зачем вы приехали сюда, в нашу родину? And I could just feel this person is going to report me straight to the FSB merely for having a beer. You get that sinking feeling. And then of course, when it comes to что вы думаете о, it's really, as soon as I hear что вы думаете о фильме, I know that's my cue. There's no winning this conversation. There's no getting out of this conversation alive. Nothing good is about to happen. So in a general sense, this is how it works. You essentially have the public discourse, what comes essentially from the government, which comes from the media, which comes from the people around you. And this is, in effect, changes the way that people, without really thinking about it, change the way they interact with strangers. When you have the rally around the flag effect, you have stronger support for the government, essentially no matter what. So you begin to polarize in society. And the polarization is, not just people who I'm afraid are going to report me to the FSB, but I also get people who, once they hear I'm from the United States, they start telling me how much they hate President Putin. In the same way that I don't have an opinion on how much you hate Ukraine, I really don't have any opinion on how much you hate President Putin. But the rally around the flag effect, this sort of stronger public discourse, creates the polarization that people view in me, either someone who's not me. They view someone who's much more friendly or much less friendly without really stopping to think, might this guy have any opinions to himself? So I can sort of leave the floor open for questions and leave it sort of an ambiguous note. But the general point about what public opinion can do to foreign policy formulation is when the public is not essentially, for or against the president. I remember when the 9/11 attacks happened and President Bush said, if you're not with us, you're against us, which in Russian is "Кто не с нами, тот против нас." And this, of course, this is what happens in a crisis. But over time, the only thing that, and whatever foreign policy mistakes the United States made 2003 and onwards, the thing that essentially helped prevent further foreign policy mistakes, and not saying, the United States never does it, is essentially that the public essentially recovered from 9/11 as a time of tragedy and a time of great shock. And they began, through their elected representatives, to reassert control over the presidency itself and start to ask more critical questions and start to regain essentially this adversarial, как соперники, role between the public and the government. And that, in a sense, helped slow down foreign policy making in the United States, which, as a person who believes sort of more as a liberal rather than a realist, I believe to myself that when the public constrains, even if the public's wrong, at least it gives both society and the government more time to consider whether they're making good decisions or not. So in terms of sort of just introduction of theory and my приключения в барах, the thing that I can sort of leave in terms of foreign policy thinking is the Russian public sufficiently controlling over the presidency and policy making, and are they sufficiently adversarial with those forces? And essentially, as Russian society and Russian leadership, have this sort of argument with itself, then we'll start to see whether foreign policy will continue to go as quickly as before. So I will stop right here because I see people are a little tired. And if anyone has any questions, this dude in the red shirt has to go first because he looks super excited. So thank you, and we'll go for questions.
You mentioned the parallels between the 9/11 attacks and the Ukrainian crisis. And I was thinking, is how developed a civil society is in a nation a factor in how fast the rally around the flag effect is going to wear off, and people will begin to question.
So in a sense, what the question is how developed is civil society, and does that sort of allow for the rally around the flag effect to wear off? Now, I've been studying political science for about 10 years, and I've yet to see a good way of really defining, sort of numerically, or at least quantitatively, the development of civil society. But at least a good rule of thumb qualitatively is how many countervailing political or economic institutions exist. And essentially that's where you can start to develop measures of political competition. I haven't done any study on this directly, but one could assume that even quote-unquote how developed the United States is, the Republicans, who were the party in power during that time, and President Bush, who was the Republican president at that time, they were able to essentially run roughshod, or they were able to more or less do whatever they wanted legislatively for like a good 5 years. So even you have like the United States, it takes 5 years for that to wear off. I would guess yes. I mean, it's sort of, there's an intuitive appeal, but I don't know the exact answer to that.
Because that people started questioning President Bush's foreign policy even before people found out that Saddam Hussein never actually had weapons of mass destruction. And I believe that one of the factors that led to this was the fact that the anti-war movement had plenty of organizations that were indeed lobbying the senators that actually in turn addressed those concerns, more liberal ones. So that might be a factor.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and for those of you who are interested in empirical political science research, we have the tools to teach you, and then you can answer this question yourself. But the long and short of it is, even those who are opposed to the war were unable to stop it, and how, at least in the United States and in many other countries, how parties get their way and how they sort of overcome political opposition is they unite everyone on their side and they divide the opposition, and they find these wedge issues. So what President Bush and the Republicans were able to do at that time is they split the Democrats on these issues of security in order to get their way on issues of economics.
Yeah. Is it possible that the rally around the flag effect might be dangerous for civil society? Such as, for example, during the Red Scare, people that oppose some of the more aggressive policies that the United States government proposed were sometimes declared communist sympathizers. So can such an effect, damage civil society development in Russia?
So, so essentially there are two questions. Can more developed civil society help make the rally around the flag effect disappear more quickly? I mean, intuitively that makes sense. And does essentially these sorts of political controversies, does it ruin the civil society, on a sort of like more micro basis? That also has like an intuitive appeal. But in essence, I'm always hesitant to answer these sorts of questions because I'd have to sort of, have the conversation, which maybe we could have over a cup of tea, is what does it mean sort of civil society, and how does it get ruined? Is it when, people say nasty things on TV?
Well, is a healthy opposition and the ability to let the opposition speak. And during political crises, for example, during war, people that, for example, want to propose a peace treaty might be declared sympathizers to the other side, or dissidents.
Or fifth columnists, that's the usual. Yeah, I mean, it certainly has, it's, I think, something that we've observed, but in order to make sort of like a categorical statement, I sort of have to sort of study this and figure out what does poisoning mean, or what does unhealthy mean? Because those are things that we know the general definition, but we don't know a specific one just yet.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Вопросы есть, вопросов нет. Okay, yeah. If anyone's nervous, we can sort of meet in, a train car or somewhere very loud.
Hi.
Hello?
Do you think you can really measure approval ratings and the rally around the flag effects by the Levada Center polls? Do you think they're a trustworthy source?
Yeah, so that's more of a statistical question, and I'm fully. Yes. So essentially, what. Okay, this will get real boring real quick, but there's essentially two questions in there. Do I believe in essentially polling as sort of a statistical construct? Yes, that's one thing. And two, the questions, and I encourage everyone to go to the Levada Center website, where they essentially have all the questions and the data, so you can sort of look. And essentially how polling works in a more general sense is they ask questions that prime people towards, let's say, positive or negative responses. And then they ask, let's say, if they're priming you to say really, really positive things about, let's say, global warming, then they'll ask you, what is your opinion on industrial economic development? And there, essentially, if you've been primed to say bad things about, or to think bad things about global warming, yet you still say good things about industrial economic development, that's in a way to show that you have a sincere belief about, maybe you doubt global warming or whatever. And so you can go look at the questions, and the questions are primed to elicit sort of distributed across different respondents. They're primed to say positive things, they're primed to say negative things, and then they're asked the real questions. And then essentially the use of statistics is made to figure out whether people are lying or not, what their sincere beliefs are. And if you really have a lot of questions, Michael Rochlitz, who's the tallest guy here, is an expert on polling, so you can really sort of ask him.
I think the argument is rather that people don't dare to say what they really think.
So there's a great series of questions directly in the last Levada Center polls, in which people were asked, do you believe the majority of respondents to this poll will vote for President Putin for re-election? And I think it was something like 70% said yes. And then the next question is, do you share the opinion of the majority? 40% said yes. So clearly, there might be some preference falsification, and I'm not an expert in each one of those questions, but once you look through those questions, you can start to see how the poll was constructed in order to elicit sort of true sentiments from the respondents. So the short answer is yes, I believe in that poll. The longer answer is this is a great way to sort of study how public opinion is done. So I'd suggest everyone to go look at the Levada Center polls, look at their methodology, and essentially see how questions are asked in order to elicit different responses.